You are listening to The Only Constant, a podcast where we go beyond the usual discussions in technology and business and aim to explore more than explain. Join me for engaging discussions with a diverse range of global thought leaders as we seek to uncover new perspectives and insights in a free-flowing conversation. My guest today is Martin Petersen, and I am your host, Lasse Rindom. Hi, Martin, and welcome to The Only Constant. I'm super excited to have you on the show today and been really looking forward to this. Also, because this is the first ever episode of The Only Constant where we're actually sitting physically in the same room. So, hi, Martin. I can look at you. Welcome to The Only Constant.
Hi, Lasse. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Martin, you are the Group Chief Information Security Officer at a multinational company. How do you sleep after generative AI?
Like a baby, I would have hoped I could say. I don't. I think it brings along a lot of new challenges we haven't seen in the same format before. And I think some of those we will discuss today. Um, so, no, I don't sleep quite as well as I used to. And that's mostly because my head is spinning around how to deal with this, and mostly how the future will be impacted by that, because I'm not sure I have figured that out yet, and I'm not sure many people have figured that out yet.
No, but how do you see the risk landscape altered since the emergence of generative AI? What's happened?
Um, I think it's been the biggest change with this technology, contrary the internet when that was a big thing when that emerged in the 90s. Nobody quite knew where this thing would go. The internet and was a joke for a lot of people. There was not a huge adoption of the technology. Then there was a very large adoption, which led to a little bubble in the beginning of the 2000s, right? Whereas with generative AI in general, it's there, it's available for everyone to use. And I think if you look at what ChatGPT accomplished with opening it up for people just to play around with it, and everybody who has internet access could get a hold of this technology and play around with it, I think that is a massive change that we haven't seen to the same degree before. Um, which, in retrospective, if you look at it, how technologies generally are adopted, we are usually, as human beings, very quick to adapt things where we see that it brings a benefit or something that's really fancy and cool, without thinking too much of the implicit risk around what is it actually that we have at hand here. And I think it's a little bit similar story here. I'm very convinced that we still haven't grasped the full risk landscape and how it alters it, this piece of technology. Think we are still in the baby steps of figuring out what it is. We have all read the dystopian novels out there and stories and watch movies around what AI can do and robots taking over. I think that's an extreme, but again, there's people with that sort of mindset. And then there's people like me who think about how can organizations and people in general use this technology in a safe way. Uh, Obviously, the technology itself needs to be secure, but how can society use this for good, and how can we mitigate the risk that are within these solutions? So I think that's very much what I'm still trying to grasp. And I think if I look at the risk landscape in particular, it hasn't necessarily added more risk onto our plate. It has rather altered existing risk and really given certain type of risk more potential
Like
for
what?
good and for evil. Um, I think if I look at it right, let's take an example in 2016. If we look at social media, right, that was actually one of the technologies also fairly quickly adapted by human beings, because suddenly you could connect all over the world. And it did not take long for people to take advantage of that in multiple ways, be that financial, be that crime oriented. But the most scary one of all is trying to alter the political landscape and the whole element of trust. I think with Gen AI, and if we take the example from 2016, what I'm alluding to is obviously the election in the US at the time, where many people have been very outspoken about that the Russians had their hands in the election in the US. And there's actually a recent piece of research around this topic, which is very, very interesting, which suggests that the marketing campaigns, let's just call it that, from in this case especially Russia, did not really alter the election itself, because it was already targeted at mostly Republican voters and vice versa, meaning it hasn't really shifted the results of the election. However, what it has done is put a huge dent in the trust in the system, because people did believe that there's
Hmm.
a foreign nation that can go in and alter your election. So it has sort of given rise to what you saw later on in 2020 in the other elections following since then, that there is all of a sudden this acceptable debate almost around rigged elections.
Yeah, and then is everything false information? Is everything disinformation? Right. So state news and state sponsored newspapers, no news outlets in Europe, are they even speaking the truth, or is just propaganda? Is it something someone's manipulating us to believe? The whole manipulation agenda because of the fake news of 2000, the fake news, the new word, fake news, right? New concept. That's what you're alluding to, isn't it?
It is very much what I'm alluding to. And if you now look at how the risk landscape altered in this domain, it's not like it's news that we try to use misinformation. I mean, the Romans did it back then. It's we've always done that to gain an advantage, a geopolitical advantage over others, over enemies in particular, or where we want to gain more influence. And with generative AI, what you all of a sudden get is a much more realistic, technology driven tool that works in the digital landscape, where you have a very, very hard time differentiating the amount of news. Because what you can do is, embed news in a news site that cites another article, that cites another article, which are all artificially created.
We don't even need that, right? Social media is all about you have 230 watt characters on Twitter
Yeah.
to capture someone's attention, and no one fact checks. It's just here's a quick piece of information. There you go, trust it, right? So it's perfect for generative AI just to spew out falsehoods, because no one looks for sources on SoMe. So the combination of SoMe and generative AI is maybe the perfect storm.
I think it is also the pace and quality, and all of a sudden, you mix emotions into that, which it can do for you now, right? If you want to have a certain or imitate a certain type of character, you can really get it to do that for you. So there's also consistency in your tweets, and that's very scary to me, because if you look at the political landscape at the moment, it's not particularly bright, right? And if you now add this misinformation campaigns and steroids on it, I am concerned about that.
Knowledge is power.
It is.
But you're also, you're from an enterprise perspective. How have the risks changed there?
I think it's a difficult question to answer. How
Still early days.
It's still very early days if you look at. So where I come from as a CISO is obviously always the safety or the security lens on there. So is the technology safe to use? And is it secure, meaning that nobody can alter it? And when I say the safety, what does it spit out? And when I say security, can I fumble with a model and alter it to give me results that in retrospect
Mm.
help my motive? I think one of the classic examples, the more in your face ones, if you think about Copilot, access management, the good old one, who has actually access to what type of documents, and now,
Inherited user rights.
oh yes, and now you have an AI that's, it's right in your face and shows you all the information that's available to you, where many people maybe still haven't actively searched for it. Now it's just part of their search. So I think that's the most immediate example, actually.
I read someone saying that Microsoft, and I don't know if this is true. So if I'm incorrect here,
Hmm.
it's just fake news, pun intended. But that Microsoft is saying that, oh, but you just have to have control over your SharePoint access rights, which everyone presumably has, and then there's no risk in Copilot. But micro- do we have control of our SharePoint? access rights, Martin. So just you're allowed to make an imaginary example. You don't have to take it from your own world. But
Yeah, let me take an imaginary example that is in general leaving sharing rights and what should be public and private information to an end user. I think in the first place we have designed the systems in a way that are not particularly user friendly when it
mm,
comes to it. I think we have done it unnecessarily complex for users to navigate it, especially when it comes to data
mm,
classification, labeling of data. I mean, that's a complex piece of task, and automation will not necessarily help you out there because it's so context driven.
mm.
Classic automation, that is. But actually, with AI, maybe there's a little bit of hope that it can provide some context to it and help us do data loss prevention methods more effectively because, and access rights for that matter. Because right now, it's a mess in every organization you look. If anybody says otherwise, I'm all ears to hear all about it, but usually that's always a problem for everyone.
But that's funny, right? It's been like 20 years of semantic web discussions on making data accessible for computers and more structured. And it seems it's just an even bigger mess today. We just have more data and it's an even bigger mess. Or am I completely wrong here?
No, I don't think so, and it's even more unstructured than it used to be, right? Because
Mm,
we are information workers, at least in the companies we work for. Whilst we also in our company in particular have a lot of workers who are not information workers, right? But at the end of the day, that's what we do. We take data and we create information out of it, and it's more and more and more of that. So yeah, it's just a pile that keeps on growing.
yeah. So let me just because I thought about you how you sleep at night, and then I wrote down endpoints on my notepad here because I, are you really nervous about the, the what do you call computer endpoints? Or are you nervous about the human endpoints more? Has that shifted with generative AI? That the focus is a little bit changed. You said we have something that can manipulate people on an emotional level, but core endpoints and physical endpoints are not something you can manipulate with emotions. So has your attention shifted a bit here?
Um, Yes and no. So what we generally observe now, where it comes to endpoints and malware in particular, is since Gen AI was generally available, what you have seen is a huge spike in malware.
Mm.
So the barrier to entry for
For
people
hackers,
who want to do evil has been lowered.
brilliant.
Brilliant, right? And the good thing though is that the quality of that stuff isn't yet, you know, where it's dangerous. But as we already talked about, it's in its infancy, right? So I think we can expect a lot more in that domain when it comes to novelty malware, self proliferation as well. When it comes to malware, I think we will see a lot more automation in that space going forward. At an earlier event, I talked a little bit more about that in depth as well, how I see that. But I think the whole way how you can do more informed automated attacks on you is something where we'll see an improvement in quality over it. Right now, there's millions of botnets scanning the internet at all times for open ports, for whatever information they can get their hold of. But taking it from that step to the next step to actually gain a foothold on the endpoints has been challenging. And if you think about what generative AI can do in this space, if it is a model without any type of restrictions, it can really, really, it really has the potential to do a lot of damage in this space, right? Because it knows all about Windows, it knows exactly how it works, or Linux, or whatever system you have, down to the level of what firmware the piece of endpoint you have might be running, and can pinpoint and pick and choose the type of malware that is most effective on your device based on the information it can obtain.
So what we've got is agile malware.
Correct. Correct. And I think that's where we headed to. So far, that has been a novelty technique. It's already been seen before generative AI, but I think now that barrier to entry for being able to develop that has lowered, and the attackers are just as creative and figuring out use cases as we are.
Hmm.
Um,
So yeah, I would actually have thought that a CISO like you would be more afraid of phishing, becoming more intelligent. I've seen incredibly well done phishing mails.
Yeah,
Very, very. I've been almost cheated a couple of times. I was like, hey, and then I was like, no, let me just check the email, but it looked very, very real, and you didn't used to do that 2 years ago.
no,
So I would have thought that would have been one of the biggest risks, actually, the human endpoint and people. But actually, getting when they get in, you're more afraid of how they are able to act when they're on the inside through this agile generative AI approach, right?
correct. The reason for that is very simple. The way our mail systems and mail protection and all that stuff is designed to actually prevent fish to reach your mailbox in the first place. It's the quality of the email that actually lands in your inbox. Yes, Gen AI has done or has ensured that that is much higher quality and that you can have a conversation which sounds much more professional, as if it's some criminal group with poor English skills or whatnot. So yeah, that's obviously an increase in risk. But if you generally look at how successful fish are, even though it's just 1%, if you have 300,000 people in the company, then that 1% is already enough. So it's not my biggest concern in an enterprise setting.
No, someone stealing $100,000.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a thing. Someone putting ransomwareing your entire infrastructure. That's a
Yeah.
completely different thing.
Yeah. So I think that's the one I'm most concerned about. Not to say I'm not concerned about the other one. I am.
Yeah.
But that's where we try to deploy strategies to mitigate that risk. So if it's just one user, then let's make sure it's only that user and that endpoint that can be hit and not everything else.
Mm.
And that my concern is then with novelty malware of sorts that can circumvent your mitigations. And that's the one I'm afraid of.
Oh. Do you have the tools to remedy that, mitigate that?
We invest a lot in security tooling to make sure that it actually works. So one of my mantras is always, as much as possible, single point of glass. And the second one is test it at all times constantly. So yes, we have the tools and the means to test whether our malware protection and other techniques are actually preventing what it needs to be prevent. Um, but again, everything is based on advanced machine learning and anomaly detection. See what processes are shouldn't run on devices and so on. But if you then have a technique that imitates regular processes running
With slight variations all the time.
exactly, then it can be very, very difficult in the current architecture to pick that up and actually alert on those things. So
That's the whole key issue with the AI ops and everything. Also, that
yeah,
you don't necessarily see it when you get a machine learning state of normalcy to some extent. What's normal?
yeah.
And you don't even know as the human behind the CISO what it has characterized as normal. So you can't say if it's not normal. It's just seen as normal. What if that normal is bad?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the overfitting, especially in these cases, right? If it has seen the same thing 99 times and it thinks, yeah, that's how it runs, and then the 100th times it sees it differently, and that one time is the bad time, but due to the 99 other times, then it doesn't raise an alert or whatnot, or the other way around. Then yeah, that's a concern here. From if we go technical on the malware protection side of things. And the other point I'm, of course, afraid of, that's a more targeted attack. So not your classical phishing, but more spear phishing and CEO fraud. That stuff, you really see an immense increase in quality of how that is carried out. How people try to imitate the voices of CEOs or decision makers in companies, because our CEOs, you are on this podcast, so it's fairly easy to imitate your voice and give somebody a ring, pretending to be you, whilst it's not really.
Maybe I should mask your voice after this.
Yeah, that would be nice, but I think it's too late for that, Lasse.
Just give you a nice, I don't know, auto tune, so you'll be a Daft Punk CISO. Anyway,
Can I be a T-Pain?
yeah, T-Pain. No, but I think that's, and also because C levels don't have a high span of attention usually, so internal messages are very often short, and precise, so it's easy to interpret something coming from a C level as an actual command, right, to do something. It's actually easy to imitate someone who gives short messages. to back office functions, right?
Correct. It's very easy to imitate that, and my concern and my job is what can I do to mitigate that risk? And I am right now limited in options to be able to do so.
Mm.
Because how do you combat that? Uh,
Yeah, that's what I was getting at. Are we looking at something where we're using generative AI to actually combat generative AI fraud?
yeah, I think so to a high degree, and we're already seeing that. If you look at the security tooling out there, they are all coming with some shape or form of generative AI
They have to,
baked
right?
within it.
As well, right?
Yeah, they do. They do. And they have a vetted interest because they also know that will be hard for them to keep up. But is that going to solve the fundamental problem of somebody imitating being another human? I think that's a challenge. Can AI detect AI?
Mm. But there's a sort of a kind of GAN, right? Adversarial networks that we're building up then. So the hackers on one side are doing one thing to attack you, and you're doing sort of the same on your end to circumvent it. And then suddenly we'll end up having super high tech technology battling each other on each side, right? Is that where we're heading?
It is, I think, it's always been an arms race between defender and attacker. That's no news there, which is also why we do a lot of, we call it purple teaming, red against blue teams. So we constantly try to attack ourselves with the newest methods out there available. But it is an arms race, and it will continue to be so.
Mm,
No matter what technology is out there, there will always be the arms race. The challenge with arms races is you can quickly hit a sort of gray zone if you look at it from a more legal perspective, because you always have to think about the attacker doesn't have any rules that apply to them.
mm,
We do,
yeah.
and that can create a conflict at some point, and it already does, because I have data privacy on the one hand side that limits me in some of the things I can do, but I have an attacker that is, he doesn't care about that. So that is a challenge, and I think we will see that more and more going forward.
So that actually leads me to another question, right? Regulation. Is that is that helping you? And what about the new regulations for generative AI? Is that even satisfying any kind of needs you have, or
Um, no, it's not satisfying my needs from a security point of view. I think it tries to do all the right things. If we think about ethics and trust and some of the issues we talked about in the beginning, so that larger corporations don't abuse this technology to get a larger foothold
Mm,
of the individual people living in the countries who are their consumers. I think that's for that purpose, and thinking about the ethics in there and the decision making behind it. If you automate a lot of things, you want to make sure that the values you represent as a company are safeguarded in that. And I think that's what the EU is trying to do here. Yeah, they have talked about watermarking AI images, and if you do a video of someone that's not really that person, that's image generated and so on, doing watermarks, but why should I care about that if an attacker doesn't have that watermark? That doesn't help me,
no,
or a nation state, or whoever it is on the other side. So the regulation doesn't help me against what I'm trying to protect the companies from.
no. The problem is the pirates are pirates, right?
Correct.
They don't fly under any flag.
They don't. And a watermark will most certainly not prevent them from doing so. So then is the next question: how well should you protect the models, and how available should they be? Should we look at limiting them? Should we look at making sure other states or pirates don't get their hands on them?
I really actually love what you're saying here because that leads me to a thing I've been saying for years is that there are people always like just automate, automate, automate in the spaces I've been um, working in. But I always said we there are two megatrends: automation and security. And of those two, security tends to win, at least for the big bulk. And, the big things. We can do a little small automation crappy thing, but big systems and security needs to be protected first and foremost. That's the point. That's also why we don't give super user access to anyone to build an automation, or we control things. Sometimes slow is a design. So you give someone an RPA bot instead of giving him super user access, so he can destroy your entire system. Um, so what I'm getting at here is just that you're saying that security maybe should go. should drive the discussion if we should allow everyone to have LLMs or generative AI, or if we should limit the availability of these tools because it's unsafe for us. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, in essence, that's what I'm trying to say, and I think there's also responsibility towards those who develop the models to work with people who can help them make them safer and more secure by design. And not saying that they aren't, but balancing, the hunger for profit uh, with the safety of the people using it. I think that's something we really need to make sure that
We're getting very close to a point where security is talking like ethics here, Martin, aren't we?
for me, generative AI is all about ethics and values.
Mm.
It's not so much a security discussion for all the reasons we just have discussed. Yes, it is a security issue, but the ethical aspect of AI is for me the most important, and what values we stand for as nations, as people, as organizations. And I think we really have to be careful of how we design our models and the outputs they generate or decisions they drive based on the values we have. So I think it's all about fairness. It is also about the accessibility to those tools, because we might leave a big portion of the population behind if we don't think about how we address those themes. And very quickly, it's in the word is generative AI. What about minorities that are in the minority representation here, right? What do you do about those? And if you just have general decisions on everything, you leave out these groups of people.
Yeah.
And I think that's to me a big concern here as well.
So we are. I tried to make a picture the other day on Midjourney of a group of finance leaders being taught AI by a consultant, me presumably. Uh, but the point, but the picture that came out was just a lot of white male. Right, to your point, so just to emphasize that again. And I thought, hey, actually, the picture, the setting was good, but it's just white males. I had to tell it, please, just a little bit of diversity, just gender diversity a little bit, And then I had to go through the normal rounds of spending half an hour just getting an image because the next images were bad, more diverse, but they were bad. Now, that's another discussion. But I've actually said on some of the previous podcasts um, that we now have the technology to do almost everything. We can work with structured and unstructured data at scale, and very efficiently, very fast. Uh, and that might require that we change our mindset a little bit, that we don't just hunt for efficiency but start thinking about what do we want to do with technology. Do we want to just make every human endpoint efficient, or we want to make our customer interaction efficient? Is what's important to us. I think that's the ethical consideration. What's actually important to us as people? Is just efficiency or something else?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a really, really good point, and I've thought about that a lot as well. Because on the one hand side, we have the clear challenge of demographics. We need to increase our efficiency if we want to just somehow maintain our lifestyle.
Mm.
Not to talk about all the sustainability issues we have currently. But if we just want to maintain our mindset of capitalization, then we need to increase productivity and find efficiencies, because people are getting older. The workforce is not necessarily getting a lot bigger, and you see the effects of that in some countries already. So yeah, there's definitely use cases for that. I think
At least for the next 15 years, right?
for the yes, and next to that as well is how do we want as a society want to provide the right level of services to our people, because a lot of the things are digitalized, right? If we look at little Denmark, you can't do a bank transfer without having a digital identity or anything of that sort, or do your tax statements and all these things. And it's actually pretty complex to get that right, and don't get a tax bill you don't want. Because
But it's also super efficient.
is it though? For whom?
Yeah. Well, for I tend to say that if you look at other countries that don't have digital identities, don't have digital invoicing, don't have digital mail, there's no end to the bureaucracy and the time it takes to get things done. It's very lean in Denmark where we have all those things, right?
It is, but it's also very complex, and we have a lot of older people who are not a
Yeah.
big fan of that. It can't. And my point was more: can we use generative AI to help those people,
Yeah.
that they get better, quicker customer service? Do we need to make it as complex as we did? Even though we are very digitized in Denmark, We don't have the same bureaucracy as other countries. Germany, I'm half German, so I can say that, where it's really, really painful, and the digitalization is slow in the public sector. Uh, but there is considerations you have to make around getting everybody on board, because ultimately that's what we need to do, and design it in a way that's fair and accessible to everybody.
Yeah, in Denmark, it was sort of a revolution that way. It
Yeah,
happened very, very quickly, right?
yeah.
It almost killed off our mail services as well because it was so quickly that we got digital mail. And that's something that you can definitely discuss if it should be that quickly. Why do we have to move that fast? Um, but I think also, uh, but Martin, what if we look at the market? You're talking now about it like it's something that we can control on a country level or society level. We should talk about as society, what do we want to do? How do we want to make it better? How do we want to include everyone? But these technologies, generative AI, as you just said, it just thrown out there to people. Ian Barkin on the first episode said that we were infected by generative AI. You're never infected by SAP. So just thrown out there. Who's throwing it out there? It's not the American state. It's not the EU. It's not Denmark. It's big tech. So are we even able to control this discussion?
Um, no, not to its fullest, because there's no incentive to do so necessarily, at least not economically. Um, the incentive is back to our ethics, and are we strong enough to counter that? And I think if we look at the European Union being one of the first ones with their regulation and the ethics policies that they put in place and so on, is trying to do something in that step. But at some point, you also need to balance technological advancement with the ethics, right? So what I guess I'm trying to say is, uh, I was surprised when Gen AI came out in the way it did.
Mm,
I was.
research preview.
Yeah,
We take no responsibility.
exactly. And you can debate for a long time whether you think that's ethical or not. Me personally, I have to say, I was a fanboy. I thought, oh my God, this is
I
awesome.
remember we had a lot of chats.
Yes, we did, and they were quite entertaining, right? So it was really, really fun playing around with it. And maybe I got to be honest here and say I might have not thought sufficiently about the consequences
Mm,
of doing so. And one of our mottos we have is stop. So pause, think, protect.
yeah.
Did I pause briefly, very briefly, too briefly? Did I think? No, when I could imitate Gandalf and make him say words I thought were funny, maybe I didn't.
I remember we did what was it? A zero trust architecture in Lord of the Rings tropes, right?
Exactly.
Explanation. That was one of the fun things we exchanged, I think. But was it really zero trust that we asked it?
Zero trust. Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe we shouldn't dive too much into zero trust these days, because there's very little when it comes to generative AI around zero trust
Mm.
and the architecture.
But I think a lot of enterprises are waking up a little bit as well to the reality that this is difficult to control, difficult to implement. We all have it. No one wants to. It's all already there, sort of installed. It's just like I said, we're infected with generative AI. We didn't decide to get it; we just got it. So everyone has it, and now we're trying to see how can we get value from it. Is it just a chatbot that sometimes makes stochastic errors, or I'm starting to see it being something that has to be boxed in a lot more. So are you concerned about the implementations that are happening with generative AI, how it's being used in processes and automations? I remember you being very, very pragmatist early on, like very, if it's just boxed in around the security levels of a normal person or something, I'm okay, right? Are you still at that level? Or you still think that same way?
Yeah, by and large, I am, because I generally think if you want to succeed in the type of role I have and not create enemies everywhere, you need to have some sort of pragmatism around you. And you need to give people the space to explore technologies in a safe way. Now, my challenge with generative AI is I haven't yet fully figured out how I can do that in a safe way. So we play around with it a lot. So what I did was have a very good discussion with some of the teams working with that and exploring it. Um, to actually not decide to do a separate security policy for generative AI. That was on the table, but build on the ethics and values policy we have, where there's, values
So
determining.
you built an ethics thing around it instead of a security policy.
Correct. Because if I think about it, a lot of the security controls and policies I have still apply to generative AI the same way as they do to everything else.
Mm.
It is, having good access policies to it. Who should have access to what information? Who should be able to get what prompt output? A CFO might want to have a very different output than the intern,
Yeah.
but both have access to the tool, but they should get different outputs depending on who they are. So how can we work with those type of scenarios and so on? So it's the same stuff. At the same time, you want to limit your organization from harm. So on one hand side, you want to provide a playground for people to work with this and understand it, just like everyone else, because we don't want to find ourselves behind again on this. On the other hand, you want to limit whatever else Gen AI technologies are out there, which might, not have the same safeguards as if you use a private Microsoft version, quote unquote private, or other technologies out there, right? So it's a little bit stick and carrot. So you need to give them a carrot that they can play around with and see for themselves whether there's benefits in this or not. I'm not the one to make that decision. Um, but at the same time, I have to help them and enable them to make it in a safe way. So I'm still yes in that, but I haven't yet found all the right box.
No, but the funny thing is that you're saying you can treat it like under your normal security framework. Well, now Sabina last week said that generative AI, you should only use it when you can work with unreliable computers. He said so. We're used to working with reliable computers, which must be easier to work with for a CISO. But now you have unreliable computers, stochastic one. It's a bell curve. The answers could be whatever, you know. So, but you see no difference there.
I mean,
You haven't seen it yet, maybe.
yeah, and the question is always: is this? It is to some extent an information security problem, um, because I is the integrity of the data and the decisions being made on the basis of that can be, as we just discussed, severely altered, right? But what I'm trying to say is that I want to limit the types of Gen AI models out there. And I think this problem is actually addressed with the ethics and values based discussion, because that's where you look at the type of output it generates and the use cases where you want to use it. And then you take the discussion around, okay, does this use case make sense for Gen AI? How can it help us? Are we sure the answers it provides are fair and the people using it are treated fairly and it actually provides you output that is reliable ish? And that requires quite a lot of engineering. It's not like it just works out of the box magically always. It just doesn't yet.
No, I think it needs a lot of orchestration. That's what I
Yeah.
usually say. Of course, engineering as well, if you want to speak on your data. But with Azure AI Search, and there's some simple tools out there that can help you do RAG, for instance, very very easily. But I think that something like just making sure it's not, if you make it categorize your data and put it into production data, for instance, you should definitely have a couple of agents, controlling each other to see if it makes sense what they're doing. Like, and I think that some frameworks like that, from a data perspective, maybe that's not your area, master data, but for something like that, I would put in some safeguards or some regulations. I think some policies.
Correct. And that's definitely right. Testing it a lot, double checking the things that you're sure that it still works. But my biggest concern is still, even though you do all those steps, and it works maybe if you convert data or, unstructured data, convert that to more structured one. Um, but what if you do it the second or third time? Now you're still doing the same test. And now you're ensuring you're still doing the same test because the model, as we discussed earlier, might change its way of giving you an output. And that's the scary part on the integrity thing, right? So how can you design a good process around?
Yeah, yeah, they update the model also all the time.
Yes.
But you can actually, I think you can circumvent that by, for instance, deploying the open source models and saying, this is the version I have, I don't deploy another one. So and no one's just doing that yet. But I think that will be something we will end up doing because Gemini, ChatGPT, and Azure, they just update as they see fit. They don't really care. But some of the open source models, you can install them on your own, deploy it on a server, and then that's the model you have. End of story.
You can of course do that, right? But then you will always have the classic discussions whether that's acceptable or not, because people always want the newest and greatest things,
Yeah.
and that is a discussion that will always be
But that's
ongoing.
actually the thing right now. The trend is to make them smaller, right? Smaller and faster. But do people really want smaller and faster? You're saying they always want the biggest, the best, right? But the trend is not making bigger and better. They say that, but I don't see where they'll get that. They talk about video data, but it's still really difficult to get more data than you had in GPT-4, especially with all the lawsuits about around getting more data, right? And how they already maybe took some data they were not supposed to take for the first models. Um, so they're talking about making it smaller and faster instead. So that is the trend right now in development, making it easier, putting on mobile devices, stuff like that. Um, so don't you think we should start working on that? Maybe your company should install an open source GPT for everyone to use.
That could be a good idea. We certainly would have a lot of good use cases for that.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that. Um,
Then you could control it and fine tune it. And Lord of the Rings and everything.
yeah, well, it would certainly help with the security aspects of it, or more particularly the data protection aspects of it, right? Because that is a huge concern, legal concern. Yeah.
Yeah.
What type of data goes in there and where does it land? And are you sure it's actually safeguarded depending on what model you use? So that's a big one.
But also making sure you have the same model all the time for everything you're doing, so it doesn't change, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but how should enterprises in general approach new, emerging, radical technologies, just like we've seen with generative AI? What's your rule of thumb, Martin?
So as I said earlier, try to be pragmatic, right? So I want to make sure that I'm an enabler and not a blocker of things. So I would like us to be included in the early stages, because if it's a new emerging technology, the team working with it or exploring it don't know it yet because it's new, and we don't know it yet. So let's explore it together, figure out together, what is this piece? How can I best help you? I mean, there is this buzzword called shift left for development processes, but it is the same for adopting new technologies. We need to be on the same page, and we need to do that and embrace that together, right? And the same goes for enterprise architects, for that matter, to be included in those things, so that it's not just one person from the business or elsewhere looking at a new piece of immersion technology and say, hey, we need this, and sits in his basement somewhere by himself, and suddenly it's everywhere. No, let's together embrace it, look at it, implement the right safeguards around it. So how do we go from a POC or a proof of value, if you see that's the more suitable model to assess it, to then adopt it in the enterprise?
Yeah, but it is about. I say that it's we typically, when we approach technology we want to implement, we look at it being proactive in prevention, maybe if we don't want it, or imitation if we want it. So we imitate someone who's done it, or we prevent it if we know what it is. But in the case of generative AI, we couldn't prevent it because we didn't know it was coming, and the CISO was very enthusiastic about it as well. So we have to do remediation instead, right? Instead of prevention. So there's only remediation left, and you can't imitate, so you can only create, right? So that kind of getting everyone together on the same boat to figure out how to remediate the bad things we've experienced so far, and how to recreate the good things from what we've experienced so far, is actually the perfect agile setting, isn't it? Where we're all constantly co-creating from front runners, and changing the vision, the strategy of the company, the security, everything's just a big mix. Nothing's waterfall, right? The waterfall approach is dead, isn't
um,
it? Novel technologies. Let's just put it there instead.
yes and no. I think for enterprises like us, with all the regulations kicking into effect, I mean, we, for one, I think one of the most indirectly regulated companies out there due to the customer base we have, full on agile models for everything just doesn't work. I think we've came to the realization that all those good agile models do not work. That being said, you still want to be flexible enough to evaluate new technologies and do that in an efficient way. And with Gen AI, that was just dumped on our labs, and we had a lot of fun with it. That was also just dumped on the company and everybody in it who started to explore how can we use it. So yeah, the remediation was a big part of it. I think what we have done, trying to do, is a more centralized take on it, right? Because in our company, introducing new technology and implementing that in your business processes just like that isn't that easy, because there are some people in that security function that have actually locked down some things, so you can't just do that, and other functions as well. But still, there's the central, it's almost call it a program management, to quickly explore all the use cases, the new technologies, and how can we make sure it's happened with some sort of governance. Still exploring together, right? It can't just be for we multi global company, so we can't control everything centrally. But we still want to know what's going on at least,
Mm.
and document where who's doing what in this space, and then learn from each other, so we don't all do the same mistakes, or have all the same positive experience, but nobody knows of it.
It sounds so difficult. It sounds like I should say it in a nice way, but maybe I can't say that. It sounds like being a parent to a teenager. I have two teenagers right now. I have to be their friend, and I have to be their regulator at the same time.
Correct.
Yeah. So always saying, if you go and say no, 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 no one will tell you what they're doing. If you go, you have to start the discussion and another place talking about the opportunities, right?
Correct, and that's the tricky part also of my role, is because on the one hand side, I have to safeguard
Yeah.
ISS from any digital damage done by hackers or otherwise, and at the same time, I can't block the business from doing business and earning money, and balancing that. Yeah, it's a very good example with the teenagers, or little brother, sister, or whatnot, to find that.
I'm also like, it's okay. He hides some things from me and he lies a little bit, but I really want him to tell me the things that are important and serious. That's the point, and that's actually very very difficult spot. I realize now.
Yeah, I mean, you can't always punish people for their mistakes.
No,
I
no.
don't think. I think you need to have a discussion with them and embrace the mistake, as bad as it can be, and take it from there, and
Yeah.
learn from it, right? Because if somebody in our organization can make a mistake that big that it can have a big impact on the security posture of us, then I damn well want to know what that mistake was.
Yeah.
So if I shoot the messenger or whoever it is, then I don't learn from it.
No, but the problem is also that
Yeah,
the structural vulnerability is your responsibility.
correct.
His mistake is a human mistake. It's a thing we do. You know that's
Yeah,
why I said that early on the pods. Humans have human rights because we're allowed to make mistakes.
yeah,
Uh, where generative AI and AI models don't have that, they're not allowed to make mistakes, basically. But if someone makes a mistake, it's something that happens. It's up to you to have prevented that mistake from ever getting out of hand through structures, through measures, through security, all around, right?
yeah, exactly. And if people make mistakes, which they do, they're allowed to do so. Um, how can I make sure that that one mistake doesn't lead to a lot of other people making mistakes or being affected by that one, right?
Yeah.
Um, that's the challenge.
So, Martin, what's the dystopian scenario in 5 years, and what's the utopian one?
uh, I would say the dystopian scenario, and I'm sure a lot of other people have already mentioned that. That's the social divide that we see at the moment. I think we will see a lot more of that. We have, unfortunately, war in Europe again, Middle East. We have a very interesting elections coming up this year. So my biggest concern in 5 years from now, if we haven't figured out how to apply a more ethical model in how we operate and how we deal with misinformation, that we see something very, very uncomfortable that we don't want to experience again.
And the more antagonistic world also creates a more challenging world from a cybersecurity perspective, doesn't it always?
It does, right? It does. And you see already now the trends into data nationalization and a lot of other different initiatives, not making my life easier, but I understand full well why people are doing that. I mean, global trade and the globalization and how we were used to it the last decades is in decline. You see that very clearly. There's more and more trade sanctions going up, and more self-sufficiency agendas, the EU, US, wherever. And you see the same trends to some extent in technology. So the very dark one for me is that we divide ourselves so much that we create old walls between us again, and that we stop caring for each other.
I said a year ago that generative AI would lead to everyone closing down their data and the internet will be closed again because no one wants someone else to steal their IP.
Correct, and it could be very well be the death of any ambition of data democracy, right? I mean, that's
Yeah. What's the utopian one then, Martin?
yeah. I mean, the utopian one is obviously that we use the technology to change a lot of the societal challenges we have at the moment. We have well working digital services for the elderly, for the young ones. We are enabling ourselves to be more creative in some way because the tedious tasks are taken away from us. So I think that would be my hope, right?
Humans creating art, not Mid-Journey.
Exactly, that we can get back to that to some aspect as well, and maybe help lower some of the barriers we build for ourselves in society.
I've mentioned this in a couple of episodes, and I still think that's an overlooked thing because we're in such an affluent part of the world, right? We're in Denmark, we're in very good jobs, both of us, and we're well educated, right? But the enablement of people who are dyslexic or illiterate or people who have no access to education, infrastructure, schools, uh, by generative AI, just having a device, everyone having a device has access to unlimited education, basically. Just, I think that's something we need to think about. Also, in a company like your company ISS, where maybe a lot of the front workers could, if they're not good at writing, maybe, but generative AI could help them communicate writing, understand contracts, all those things. There's an enablement thing there that we are sort of not even talking enough about, I think, which is actually a Sputnik effect to some extent. That's part of my utopian scenario that we're sort of going to enable, you know, everyone that's not privileged like us to become privileged very quickly. That it's a crazy explosion of resources, human resources.
No, and I fully agree to that. Right, I see it as a help
Yeah,
for a lot of people out there in society if we get it right.
yeah. If we get it right.
Yeah, and that's again back to the ethics why those are so important.
Well, Martin, this has been a really, really great discussion. I really enjoyed our conversation, and there's always a lot of really good insights from you. I love your pragmatic approach. I also love your deeper considerations and trying to balance that all the time. I really think that's what makes you always interesting to speak to. And now for the final question: what is the only constant?
For me, the only constant is to balance opportunity and risk. I think that's the most important job that I have in the organization is to make sure that on the one hand side can enable the business to explore new opportunities in a safe and secure way, and at the same time protect the company from external threats or insider threats to make sure that what we do is actually in harmony and that we build up trust in the services that we deliver within the company, also to our many customers, that we protect the people within our company from harm, and that we do not just throw in new technology without thinking first on how we want to use it. How we are going to make sure that it's actually safely used in the organization as well. Because only, it's my belief that only if you are able to do that, you can create value.
That's a really great answer, Martin. Thank you for being on the only constant, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Lasse. It was a pleasure.
You've listened to The Only Constant, a podcast sponsored by Basico.